This is the border of Rye, New York, and Greenwich, Connecticut. Some people refer to Greenwich as the gateway to New England. The border is divided along the Byram River, a small river that forms the southern border between New York State and Connecticut. But there's an interesting story to be told about this border, and how it gave Connecticut its distinctive panhandle. 2 weeks ago, we at Mieum Media published a video that talked about the notch in Connecticut's northern border. But there's perhaps a more striking part of the shape of the state, the so-called panhandle in the southwest corner. The towns of Greenwich, Stamford, New Canaan, Darien, and Norwalk all jet out into what seemingly would be New York State.
Henry Hudson first landed on these shores in 1609, went up the river that bears his name. And he was sailing for the Dutch, and so the Dutch laid claim to what became New Amsterdam, the harbor, Manhattan Harbor. The English, of course, were also very keen to colonize the New World, and they established colonies in southern Connecticut and Long Island. The Dutch and the English were longtime rivals, naval powers. They clashed at sea, and the Dutch were a very mercantile economic powerhouse. So there was also a clash of two mercantile economies.
This is Robert Marchant, a reporter for the Greenwich Time newspaper, and author of Westchester, History of an Iconic Suburb, which went on sale last week. He has written extensively about the history of southern Connecticut.
And of course, let's not forget the Native Americans, the Munsee, as the scholars call them today, the Lenape, were supposedly selling off chunks of their land to the English or the Dutch. But of course, the native inhabitants didn't conceive of land sales the way we do today. They viewed the selling of land as more of a lease arrangement with a military alliance, and it made no more sense to them to sell off a piece of land than it would be to sell a piece of the sky or a piece of the ocean.
According to How the States Got Their Shapes by Mark Stein, this conflict between the English and the Dutch emanated from a charter bestowed on Connecticut by King Charles II. It didn't matter that this boundary overlapped Dutch claims, since England and Holland repeatedly went to war over their American territories. But when England ousted Holland for good in 1674, turning its land into Delaware, New Jersey, and New York, Connecticut's Pacific coast ruffled the feathers of New York. A new arrangement was needed between New York and Connecticut.
In 1683, a grand bargain was made that gave the 5 towns that were in Connecticut, Greenwich, New Canaan, Darien, Norwalk, to Connecticut. But since New York was giving up all this land, they said, hey, you've got to give us something in return. So that's why there's that angle that bites into Connecticut and is now part of New York State. Under the bargain of that 1683, 2 miles in width, 50 miles long. They called it the oblong.
This map from 1799, although not geographically accurate by contemporary standards, depicts New York's oblong between the two territories.
And it also cut out Rye and Bedford and put them into New York State, which caused a lot of hard feelings. Rye and Bedford were very much linked to Connecticut. They paid taxes to Hartford. They sent representatives to Hartford. And one of the major incidents in 1697 was the county sheriff in Westchester came to Rye on county business for New York State. And he was not well received. In fact, there was a major had been sent down from Stamford with a troop of dragoons. And as the county sheriff later recalled, fell into hard words and said, we are here to protect the inhabitants of Rye under their government of Connecticut, and they sent the county sheriff of Westchester packing. And New York State later called it a forcible invasion.
At this point, you might be wondering why these areas were so significant as to be fought over so fiercely.
Greenwich and the colonies in southern Connecticut and New York State and Rye were valuable territory, close to New York City and accessible by boat and ship. This in the era before modern roads, travel was very difficult. So anywhere you could get to by boat and trade was desirable real estate. And the farmland was never very good in southern Connecticut, but pasture land was excellent, lots of waterways, and that meant you could graze cattle, sheep, and other livestock.
Given this tumultuous history, I wanted to find out for how long any bad blood lingered.
I think there was still some hard feelings even into the early 19th century. I think it's funny how those ancestral memories linger. Rye and Bedford, I think there was still resentment that they'd been sort of stolen from their ancestral homeland in Connecticut and shoved into New York State. So it was something that lingered, I think, well into the 19th century. Nowadays, I think there are no hard feelings. We tend to think of the past as a distant, far-off place. But as Faulkner said, the past isn't dead. It's not even the past. And so the things that affect our lives today are very much the results of the whims and impulses and desires of people hundreds of years ago. And the crazy boundary line with Connecticut and New York State is a good example of that.